clarification we need before we step forward? Any questions from you? No questions? Morning. Any question about Unit 4 before we move on to Unit 5? No? Okay.
The involvement of in the marketplace, it has to be categorized as a non-linguistic factor, social factor. I don't know how to.
The linguistic marketplace,
Yes.
it's a social factor. So if you want to call it external factor, that's okay. It's a non-linguistic factor. We're moving on to a different unit. But
It was something about the Maori and the other.
Pakika.
Yes. I don't understand
The
the
difference
difference.
between Maori English
Yeah.
and Pakika English.
Yes.
Maori English is the English, the variety of English spoken by people of Maori descent, the natives of New Zealand. And Pakika English is the variety of English spoken by white New Zealanders.
Okay.
Pakika is the name that is given, it's a Maori word that means white or white New Zealand. And this paper contrasts some features of each variety.
Thanks.
Okay.
So let's start with Unit 5. One of the central topics in Unit 5 is language change. In Unit 4, we have dealt with a related concept, that of language variation. Unit 5, we deal with a different but related concept, language change. Two different concepts, however, they are related in some way. Those of you who have read the material,
All of them.
you need to know who are they. What's the relationship between language variation and then
Social linguistic variation.
any idea? Yes. Really?
Hi. It might be related to the fact that language change derives from language variation. For language change to occur, we need variations.
Okay. Let's see. To your I know. Can you repeat what you said first?
The language change derives from language variation or social linguistic variation.
Always. Is that always the case? Is it true that social linguistic variation always lead to language change?
No, not always.
So, not a deterministic
No.
relationship, like given social linguistic variation, then we can explain language change. That is not necessarily the case. However, your second utterance is more precise. You said that social linguistic variation can lead to language change.
Okay.
And that is correct. That is correct. In other words, social linguistic variation is a necessary but not sufficient condition for language change. That is to say, it is a prerequisite for language change. So, So let's recap on this idea. Language change begins at social linguistic variation. That is to say, at a starting point, what we can notice at the level of society is an alternation, or the fluctuation between two or more, variants of a social linguistic variant. That is variation, as you know it.
Does it imply, I'm not sure about this, but
Claria, but I don't remember your name.
Valentina,
Valentin, thank you.
does language change imply that one variant becomes more used across time than the other, whereas social linguistic variation just implies the existence of a variable?
Thank you very much for your question, because that is the central issue. That is really the central issue. What happens? We said, this is what you already know, that social linguistic variation refers to a phenomenon in which you see an alternation in the use of variant of a social linguistic variable that is kept constant. That is to say, the proportions of use of the different variants are maintained throughout time. One example of that is, I'm sure you remember when we talked about these variables. Which are the variants? Okay. The bigger, nasal, and okay.
The dealer is the second, right?
The bigger and the
Alveolar.
alveolar. Yes.
Alternation.
Yeah. Bigger and let's say standard variants and the non-standard. This is an alternation that has been documented for many, many, many decades. And guess what? It's stable. That is to say, people in different speech communities use these forms at different rates. And that has been kept constant throughout time. That is to say, neither of these is increasing or decreasing in the frequency of use across time. to a previous frequency of use, right? It has to be sustained. Only in those cases we can identify something that social linguists call change in progress. Right? So now, if we know that this variable and its variance have remained constant throughout time, what's the technical term to identify a variable that is not undergoing change? I hear whispers right now. Stable variable. Okay.
Variable, right?
So, stable variable is a variable that is not undergoing.
This is a good opportunity to rectify one of your papers in the reading materials. Chapter 9 about language change. Chapter 9 by Home. Page 219. Are you all there? Page 219, right? The paragraph that starts a great deal of linguistic variation is stable. Are you there? Yes. Okay. Third line. In that city, how do you pronounce that, the name of that city? Norwich. With a G, like in jaw. Strange spelling, because it doesn't match the pronunciation as usual. In Norwich, as elsewhere, the forms in and in and h drop in are also examples of stable variables, not variants. The variants are each of the options, so they cannot be stable or unstable. What is stable or unstable is the abstraction that fluctuates. The forms in and in? No, because they are not stable variants. My point is the adjective stable and the adjective unstable has to be applied to the noun variable only. Then we go on. The patterns noted for different groups in the community have not changed over the last 50 or 60 years. That's why the variables are stable. The substitution of a glottal stop for th in certain positions, on the other hand, is increasing in Norwich. So that's one of the two variants of a variable. Let's draw the diagram with this variable on the board. The variable t with the two. Yeah. Variable t with the two variables. And the glottal stop. It's like a question mark, but instead of a line at the bottom. There. So the substitution of a glottal stop for in certain positions, on the other hand, is increasing in knowledge. The glottal stop is being used more frequently and more frequently and more frequently, and that means that the other option, the oral stop, the T, is being used less frequently, less frequently, less frequently. That's a case of variation. Is that a case of variation? If one of them is used more frequently and the other one is used less frequently? Okay, it's a case of language change. And is it a case of variation? Of social linguistic variation? It is. And at the same time, it's a case of change in progress. The case we discussed firstly, the ing.
Decreasing if the person is being used. That even though the other variant is being used less frequently, it still exists. So there is variation.
Exactly. So there are two alternations. There are two alternatives for the T in Norwich, and both are used. Both coexist, and both are used by different social groups at different rates. So that's why it is a case of social linguistic variation. Because one of them is increasingly being used more and more frequently, and the tendency is sustained, then we can say that it's a case of change in progress. On the other hand, the ing is a case of social linguistic variation, but not of a change in progress. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. So, the substitution of a glottal stop for T in certain positions, on the other hand, is increasing in knowledge. The use of D for the initial sound in then and then, so this is a different case. The variable would be the TH. Then and then.
This one is a big.
The spelling TH. Yeah, okay, that's an option. And then the variants are fricative and the fricative. Yeah. Okay. The use of D for the initial sound in then and then is an example of what?
Stable variable.
A stable variable. In New York. Okay. There is no evidence that the vernacular pronunciation with D stop is increasing. Eso es por la razón por la que los profes de fonética le bajaban puntos en los horarios, porque decían the weather instead of the weather. Well, since native speakers of English in New York fluctuate between the weather and the weather, the house. Okay.
Now, if we said that this and this are stable variables, what are these? Let's see. What are these? Unstable variables. Okay. Of course, the task of the social linguist is to identify if a variable is stable or unstable in a particular speech community. by Mayor Hall. Page 153.
Aprovecha. Hay una trompeta. Está bien. Tenemos una trompeta en clase. Tenemos una trompeta en clase. Ay, qué bonito.
Write down the following questions. And you can give me some time, 5 minutes, for you to answers.
Que Dios les bendiga.
The answers, but jot down some ideas so that you can report them later, right? The idea is to analyze this graph, the one found on Mayor Hall page 143, and answer the following questions, right? Number one. What is the variable under study? And let's see, 1B. What are its variants? Sorry, which are its variants? Which are its variants? Number 2, what kind of variable is it? Okay. Number 3, what social factors are taken into account? Now, the number 4, consider the social group of female speakers and the patterns identified. Does it indicate change in progress? Of course, a yes/no question is followed by explain fully. Can you repeat what does it indicate? Change in progress?
Changing progress.
Of course, the answer is yes or no, but then you need to back up your answer with an explanation. You can work the people sitting next to you, but
5 minutes. Okay, 5
como son distintos, aunque no se da generalmente más. Como que es un patrón con patrón. Sería que le puse por este grupo de la uso, digamos, para mí, y además con lo que lleva acá, porque dice, acá te dice, y la variable sería el existential sentence. o sea, que todavía no decimos tipo que sea verb to be o el auxiliary verb to say.
Variation, variationist, and all the family of words which are related, they are pronounced with this so it's good to be aware. Sorry, please.
The variable under study is the non-standard use of was in existential sentences. Or another way of putting it is the verb to be non-standard use of past tense.
Okay, but that is a variant. The non-standard
Use of was in existential
but is that a variable or a variant? And if it is a variant, which variant? The standard or the non-standard? You don't follow me. Okay. Let's see if I can guide you there. Let's identify the variable, that form that varies. Okay. Okay. Where? That is to say, in the context. People in this speech community tend to fluctuate between there was no cars and there were no cars. So, okay. Of course, the naming of the variable, there is an abstraction, right? The source of variation. So there are different ways in which you can name the variable. But they are in existential clauses. Okay. Is that what you said? Because I heard non-standard. Claro, pero si hay que decir non-standard, está explicando la variante. ¿Me entiendes? So, where in existential clauses? Okay. Other option?
Sorry, would it be where one of the variants and the variable is the verb to be in simple past in existential
Yes,
sentences?
exactly. That's perfect. refer to the variable. But what you said is perfect. In that way, you avoid confusing. So the verb to be in existential clauses in the simple past tense. Perfect. Your name? Malin?
Valentina Ley.
Ah, Valentina. Ah, there's another Valentina. Okay. Okay. Yes? Do we all agree on this? Okay. Now.
I wasn't certain of the part about the part because it also mentioned others. Like what
Okay, but this is not what the graph shows, right? Because in this graph, the information you get is only about the distribution of the non-standard was in existential clause. So in that specific linguistic environment, not in any other. So, yeah. And which are the variants?
We can, Professor Gallagher, we can avoid these square brackets
Okay.
because these are,
Don't
These
say
are not-
because I was going to answer.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and if you want, we can just. Okay. Okay. Yes? Now, what kind of variable is it? Okay, but then you jump into language change. Uh-huh. But is it a phonological variable? No. Okay. Right. A grammatical variable or a syntactic variable. Right? So that's why Professor Martinez was saying remove the brackets because these are not phonological variants. Right?
Can we specify if the variants are standard or non-standard? For
Yes.
the case?
Yes.
So would be
You can
standard,
say
where, and was non-standard.
yeah, standard where and non-standard was.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now, what factors are taken into account? Okay. What kind of factors are these?
Yeah, another one.
And okay. What kind of factors are these?
Social.
Okay. Social.
External.
Okay. Exactly. Social, demographic factors, or external factors. Okay. Now comes the interesting part, or the part that we are interested for in Unit 5. If we consider the pattern that is being described for the group of female speakers, right? Like to say the group of, how many groups, by the way? Do we find this is key, right? It's not enough to compare two age groups to identify changing progress. At least 3 or more groups. We were discussing with Professor Martin, the more groups you have, the clearer the pattern. Right? You can observe it more clearly.
One question. What do you call those groups that are identified with the numbers on the horizontal axis? 20 to 30, 30 to 50, 50 to 70, what do you call those groups? No. Age groups. A generation is a different thing. A generation involves 15 years in statistical terms. And even though some social linguists like to talk about generation, strictly speaking, these are age groups. And And even though this comes from an excellent paper by a brilliant social linguist, this is something you don't do in the presentation of results. 20 to 30, 30 to 50, then the person who's 30, which would be full time. So this should be 31 to 50, or 20 to 29, 30 to whatever. And the other thing is we have 10 years here, 20 years here. So that's okay. Yeah. Okay, but we forgive Sally.
The neat thing is to, take that into account. So they're going to group people, taking into account, the passing of 10 years or more, right? Okay, now let's describe this pattern. Let's consider different frequencies of use for the non-standard form. What happens when we look at people in the youngest age group? Of course, we're considering women only, right? When we look at the first age group, right, the youngest age group, we can say that they use the non-standard variant
More frequently than men do.
No, more frequently than the other age.
Okay, but it's just, but it's 90%, right? 90% of the times. That's a lot, isn't it? A lot. 90% of the time. Not always, but most of the times, as you said. Okay, when we move into the second youngest group, we observe that women use the non-standard form how often? Probably 80 or 70 something percent of the time.
75?
Exactly, yeah. Somewhere in the middle, between 70 and 80. That's right. Then, as we look at the third age group, okay, 60–70% of the times, right? And then the oldest age group, 60% of the time. Considering the information that you find there, right? Is this a case of changing progress? Or Julieta? Why?
Because we can see that the increase of use is constant.
Okay, constant
Because-
across generations. She said that the increase in the frequency of use is constant across generations. Right.
I have a question for Julieta. How can you interpret that there is an increase,
No, a decrease. No, I said a decrease.
a decrease?
A decrease in use is non-standard. Right?
No.
It's an increase.
Okay, then we have some disagreement. Some of you say there is an increase, Julieta says there is a decrease.
I understood increase.
So the increase of the non-standard or the increase of the standard?
You're missing. See, I thought the same way as below. Well, because we're not very good with numbers, probably I thought the same. But actually it's an increase because it's going from the youngest people to the oldest. So you need to look at it like it's mirrored.
But the percentage is what we're looking at, there's a
Yeah.
decrease of the percentage. Like, we're going from 90 to 60.
No, no abrí la boca cuando
So they
But in age, as time progresses, it's getting
Okay, so we need a basic question then. Cuadrado. How do you interpret increase from this information that we have? Age groups with different proportions of use. How do you make heads from tails? How do you interpret that there is an increase in the use of the non-standard variant if the only information you have is that the users of these variants at these frequencies belong to different age groups?
because it's an apparent time study, so
Oh, what does that mean?
that we're taking the ages of the people to mean the passing of time. So the
Excellent.
oldest people mean before, and the youngest people mean now.
That's the answer. So this is an apparent time study. And as Mila said, an apparent time study doesn't involve actually waiting for time to go by, waiting for 5 decades until we can observe if the same people changed the proportions in which they used the non-standard verb. What this author did was carry out a study at one point in time. What do you call that kind of study? A synchronic, not diachronic, a long time, 5 decades, but a synchronic study. Or we could talk about synchronic data. Data that comes from one point in time. And she grouped the speakers into different age groups, which, as Milagro said, this can be interpreted, or we can simulate or model, pretend the time is passing. How so? How so? How grouping people into different age groups? How can grouping people into different age groups simulate the passing of time? Milagros or anybody?
I think it's, I don't remember, I'm trying to find the page. Because as speakers reach the end of the critical period and they stop changing the way in which they speak, we can understand them as being sort of like a goalpost for how speech looked like at the time that they were.
Okay, you mentioned several things that require explanation. What's the critical period? Those of you who are in the teaching track, put your hands up.
Anotado yo.
You,
Yo estoy inscrito.
so you've studied the critical period hypothesis.
2 años.
Methodology for, right? Can
No
you
hice ni
explain
didáctica
to the
general.
to the future translators what that is? That's a hypothesis, something that is, that's an, people who study language acquisition assume that in the process of socialization, people acquire the phonology and the core grammar of their mother tongue up to a certain age, right?
Yes.
And then after that, what you get is the learning of more sophisticated grammar or vocabulary. But the foundation, the core of your linguistic system is acquired at a very early age. Some say at around the age of 15, but because that is a theoretical postulate, there isn't an exact date. But we do know that at a very early age, whether it's up to adolescence or not, that's a matter of debate, but that's the general assumption, right? Then, social linguists assume that the way people speak today is pretty much the result of having been socialized in their childhood and in their early teen years, and their current speech reveals the norms that were used in their community when they were socialized back then, when they were children or teenagers. Okay? So, if we observe the speech of someone who is 70, then we can have an idea what the norms were in the community 60 years ago. Imaginemos que este estudio fue en el 2025. So that means 1965. Right? Kind of. If you get people in their 50s and 70s, then we can supposedly, according to the critical theory hypothesis and according to social linguists that use that assumption in their paper, then if we observe people who are 50 or 70, we can have an idea of what the norms in force in the community were in 1975, 60? 85. Ustedes hablan un poquito. Okay.
¿O sí?
¿Cuánto lo usan?
Dice que el gráfico va para atrás, digamos, por eso que hablamos de que es un Big Brain.
Claro. Mi abuelo tenía un 60%, pero no para el gráfico. Yo tengo 90%, yo sé que ahora.
Pero entonces para esto, mecánica porque estamos sabiendo que es una parent time study, porque si no sería al revés, sería una real time study.
This is age, right? And this is year of birth. Okay? Sometimes you get in this graph, sometimes you get information about the age of the speaker, sometimes you get year of birth. But in any case, what this helps the social linguist infer is what was speech like so many years ago. Okay? So why is this important? Because there may not be audio recordings. Well, now it's difficult to imagine having no audio recordings 6 years ago. But in the past, that was really difficult. But with this trick, social linguists can simulate the passing of time. The problem is here, Julieta, that we're going from recent to long time ago. Okay? That's why this looks like a decrease. But in reality, you have to read this graph like this, in the opposite direction. In the past, there was lower use. And as we get to the present, the curve is going up. So there is an increase in the use of the non-standard words.
Yes, how can you tell? Because you are using chronic